Our next presenter today is Jeff Kiefer. Jeff administers the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Partners for Fish and Wildlife Habitat Restoration Program for Indiana. Working in partnership with private landowners, local governments, contractors, and conservation agencies and organizations to restore wetland, grassland, and forest habitats for migratory birds, threatened and endangered species, and other wildlife. He coordinates the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service involvement with USDA agencies and Farm Bill conservation programs, including the Wetlands Reserve Easement Program. He also serves as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife representative on various steering committees and technical advisory boards. So please welcome Jeff, and thank you so much for presenting with us today.
Thanks, Amy, and afternoon, everybody. Just wanted to give you an overview of the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, which is the Fish and Wildlife Service's habitat restoration program for private landowners. And kind of like Doug, I'll give you a little brief history of the program. Started in 1987. Actually, this is the most recent poster that we have that was for our 30th anniversary, but now we're pushing 40 years in 2027. So coming up pretty soon. But initially, the program started as an effort to try and improve waterfowl populations. It was focused, it was kind of an outgrowth of this thing called the Mid-Continent Waterfowl Management Project in the late 70s, early 80s. And then once the CRP program first got established with the 1985 Farm Bill, that created a lot of opportunities in the landscape. At the time, there was no CP23 or any of the wetland restoration practices under CRP. And so you had a lot of CP1s, CP2s, basically grass plantings that were out on the landscape that had a lot of drained wetland basins. And they were under a 10-year CRP contract, but no opportunity through CRP to restore those wetlands. And so Fish and Wildlife Service took that opportunity to work with landowners to restore wetlands. And actually, the program started in the Midwest region in Minnesota in 1987. And shortly after that, it started to expand geographically into many other states. Indiana, we started in 87, 88 timeframe. But over time, the program has kind of evolved to include much more than just waterfowl. Waterfowl is still a big focus of the program, but also include things like grassland birds, a lot of declining migratory bird species, grassland birds, early successional forest birds, shorebirds, threatened and endangered species like the copper-bellied water snake, and then more recently, pollinators, including the candidate species, the monarch butterfly. And so the program really evolved to focus on the needs of and in the interests of the landowners, as well as the objectives of the Fish and Wildlife Service in terms of its focal species. So in terms of the Partners program in Indiana, relatively small program. We have 3 full-time private lands staff that are scattered around the state, and then 2 other folks that are on national wildlife refuges that are primarily refuge biologists, but do some private lands work on the counties around those refuges. So the 3 full-time folks, one is located here with me in Bloomington at the Indiana Private Lands Office. We're also co-located with the Ecological Services Office here in Bloomington. And then we have 2 other folks in the northern part of the state that are in partner offices in Northeast Indiana. Scott Fetters sits in the USDA office there in Warsaw. And then Jared O'Brien is with the DNR office at Kankakee State Fish and Wildlife area up in Northwest Indiana. So our program is kind of guided by a strategic plan. We do a 5-year strategic plan, every 5 years. And this current plan, we're kind of right in the middle between fiscal 22 and 26, which is focused on 5 primary goals. Conserving habitat is the primary effort through both financial and technical assistance to landowners. Since we do most everything with partnerships, that broadening and strengthening those partnerships is a key component. Information sharing, doing outreach and education opportunities to landowners, landowner groups, and others is a big part of what we do. Providing professional development and training opportunities for employees, for our employees, our staff is a huge focus for us. And then increasing accountability. Most of our accomplishments are talked about in terms of acres of habitat or miles of stream improved, but we're constantly looking for ways that we can provide more information on things like biological outcomes or social outcomes of our program. So that's a big part of what we're trying to accomplish as well. So our strategic plan has a number of focal species or focal species groups that are emphasized both at the regional level and the state level. Waterfowl is still a big focus of our program. There are specific species of waterfowl that are targeted depending on what state in the Midwest you're in. But waterfowl in general in Indiana is primarily mallards, wood ducks, blue-winged teal are probably the three primary breeding species that are focused. There's also the whole group of migratory birds that are in decline, primarily grassland birds, shorebirds, and certain forest birds, particularly early successional forest birds, are targeted as well. Pollinators, both listed species like rusty patch bumblebee and candidate species like the monarch butterfly, as well as the whole host of native insect pollinators, bees and other species are targeted through the program. And then listed and at-risk species, which we have a number of those from different taxa in Indiana. The ones you see there, copperbelly water snake, Indiana bat, eastern Massasauga, and a whole host of freshwater mussels that are either threatened or endangered in Indiana. So along with the focal species, then we've got these priority habitats that we target. And for the most part, in Indiana, we're talking about wetland restoration and enhancement, grassland restoration and enhancement, and then oak savanna and oak woodland restoration and enhancement, as well as aquatic habitat. Doug mentioned the dam removal. That's something that our program has been involved in the last 5 to 7 years as well. And actually, we do a lot of projects in cooperation with, in partnership with LAIR, as well as our National Fish Passage Program. Done a number of dam removal projects on streams, particularly up in Northeast Indiana, the Eel River, Cedar Creek, the Tippecanoe River, and others, primarily for the benefit of federally listed mussels. So kind of looking at areas that those dam removals can impact the mussel communities in those stream reaches. So again, with our strategic plan, we have geographic focus areas that we target the majority of our work in. It doesn't mean that we're restricted solely to those areas, but that's where we do the bulk of our projects. If you can see in the left-hand side, the map that shows the completed projects over the past 20 years or so, you can see that the majority of those fall within those focus areas, but there's a lot of projects that are outside of those areas. So we can still do projects that are outside of the focus areas, but they're more confined to kind of unique projects that are, say, large sites or unique partnerships, or particularly urban conservation projects where we're providing habitat for schools and parks where there's an environmental education component that's part of that. So we do have a lot of flexibility in terms of how we can implement those projects and where. Just some of the general criteria on the program. So the focus is primarily on private land, but it also can include local and county public lands, which would include things like parks, schools, and so forth. The private side can include individuals, can include NGO-owned lands, non-governmental organization-owned lands, land trust, corporate lands. So there's a lot of flexibility there. Really, the only lands that we can't do work on are state and federally owned lands. So the projects have to benefit what we call federal trust resources, which are either migratory birds, threatened and endangered species, pollinators, or national wildlife refuge lands. So one of the focuses of our effort is to have our staff on national wildlife refuges work with landowners that are adjacent to those national wildlife refuge lands to improve water quality or connectivity, reduce invasive species, things like that. So the national wildlife refuge lands are also a focus for us in terms of targeting the private lands that are adjacent to those. There is an emphasis on those focus areas like I talked about, but there's also some flexibility in doing projects that are located outside of those geographies. We don't require any cropping history like some of the Farm Bill, particularly CRP. We do have a 5-acre minimum size for grassland habitats, except for sites that we do school and educational projects on. So if we're working with a school or a park where there's an educational component, then we can go smaller than that 5-acre for a prairie or a pollinator habitat. And then some of the other habitat types like wetlands can be smaller as well. We do a lot of half-acre pothole restorations up in the northeast part of the state, for instance. We do have a 10-year minimum agreement that the landowner signs, or 15 years for a reforestation or a tree planting program. The cost share varies a lot. We don't have a specific cost share rate per se, but most projects, the cost share rate ends up being about 50 to up to 100%. We try and get the landowner to provide some, whether it's cash or in kind or a combination for kind of some of that buy-in for the project, but we do work with a lot of other partners. So the funding that might come from us might be a quarter of the total, but we're bringing in funds from other partners that can increase that cost share rate, and then hopefully get some additional from the landowner to round that out. So it's really flexible and project by project. In terms of how we put these cost share efforts together. A lot depends on the part of the state and what kind of partnerships that we have with grant funds and other things that are going on in different areas of the state. And then we have various options as far as our cost share for providing that to the landowner. Actually, the most difficult way from a paperwork and a process standpoint is when we provide funding directly to the landowner. It becomes federal financial assistance then, which has some additional strings attached. But we can do things like purchase seed or trees from a local vendor and provide that directly to the landowner. We can hire contractors directly, although we're limited on the dollar amount for those on a relatively small amount. So we do have a $25,000 per project cap for our program, but that would include just the funding that comes from us. So we can put together a larger project if we're bringing in partners from other entities, other organizations. So I just want to highlight a couple of those other partnerships that I kind of referenced earlier, and one of the key ones that we've been engaged in over the years is the partnership involving Ducks Unlimited, DNR, Pheasants Forever, and some others up in the northeast part of the state, which has been supplemented by North American Wetland Conservation Act grants, that NAWCA acronym there. So Ducks Unlimited typically will apply for those grants and will get funding specific for private lands restoration in that whatever that geography is. Northeast Indiana has been a historic area for us to do wetland restoration, a lot of drained pothole wetlands up in that part of the state. And so that's been a big effort for us to do wetlands and grasslands, primarily for waterfowl production, but also for a lot of those other species that we talked about earlier. And more recently, that focus area has expanded to include other counties in northern Indiana as well. So we do this under a cooperative agreement with Ducks Unlimited, and they use those NAWCA funds to supplement our funds, as well as funding that the DNR, Pheasants Forever, and other partners bring to the table for those projects. We also get a supplemental appropriation with our partners program through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative for work within the Great Lakes Basin in Indiana. And this includes actually the whole Midwest and Northeast states that are part of the Great Lakes watershed as well. But for Indiana, we're kind of limited to that sliver of watershed up in the Northeast and Northwest part of the state that drain into either Lake Michigan or Lake Erie. But that brings some additional funds that we can use to bring to the table for habitat projects in those focus areas within the Great Lakes watershed. And we also have a partnership with Ducks Unlimited up there to utilize Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife Restoration Act grant funding to do habitat restoration on private lands as well. And then we have a MOU with the National Wild Turkey Federation to target joint projects up in the northern part of the state where there's overlap between Indiana NWTF focal landscapes and our geographic focus areas, primarily for things like prairie restoration, oak savanna and oak woodland, invasive species habitats, or invasive species projects to benefit habitats for wild turkeys. And of course, many of those habitats that benefit turkeys are also going to be benefiting a lot of those migratory birds that are a focus area for us. And then one other area I kind of alluded to earlier that we emphasize, and this is where a lot of our projects come into play that are outside of our geographic focus areas, is working in that urban landscape. That's part of our strategic plan emphasis to kind of look at kind of underserved areas, particularly in the urban landscape where, you know, a lot of the people that live in those urban areas get limited ability to interact with the natural world. And so particularly from a school standpoint or a park standpoint, providing pollinator habitat can really enhance those educational opportunities in the landscape. So we do a lot of work with schools, with county and city parks, you know, just trying to provide opportunities for especially youth to kind of engage with nature a little bit more than, you know, get away from the screens and try and get outside a little bit and get your hands dirty. So we've done a lot of those projects over the years, and that continues to be a focus for us going forward. And I believe that's all I had. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer those.
Okay, here's a question for you, Jeff. Any particular work with Kirtland snakes?
Not specifically as a target species for us. It is a state listed species, not a federally listed species, but we have done some work in the bean blossom bottoms area here in Monroe County that has benefited Kirtland snakes. So certainly the you know, the opportunities to restore and enhance wetlands where Kirtland snakes are present is going to be something that we're interested in. But it's not, since it's not a federally listed species, it's not a specific focal species, but yeah, it's going to be a beneficiary of a lot of the wetland restoration we do within its range.